In a world where appearances command attention, an old man in humble attire walked into an upscale restaurant, ignored and dismissed. Little did anyone know that this stranger would soon hold the power to turn their world upside down, and that a single act of quiet dignity would leave a legacy they would never forget. Stay tuned to see how one man's quiet strength and a single unexpected twist changed everything, and left a lesson no one in that restaurant would ever forget. The evening lights glowed warmly inside the restaurant, casting a soft glow over the polished tables and golden decor. It was an elegant place, the kind of restaurant that echoed with laughter from well-dressed diners and whispered conversations about exotic vacations, new cars, and prestigious careers. Waiters glided between tables, their uniforms perfectly pressed, serving delicate plates of gourmet dishes with a formal smile. Everything about the restaurant spoke of wealth, privilege, and exclusivity. People who came here didn't just come to eat. They came to display their status, to feel important, to be seen. In the middle of this finely tuned scene, an old black man entered the restaurant quietly. He wore a simple, clean shirt and an old, slightly worn jacket. His clothes, though neat, didn't match the glitter and polish of the place. His shoes had scuffs, and his jacket seemed a little too big for his slender frame. As he walked in, some heads turned, glancing at him with mild curiosity, others with quiet judgment. He was different from the usual patrons, and the difference was noticed immediately. Some diners exchanged looks, a few raised their eyebrows, and others whispered to each other with faint smirks. The man didn't seem to notice, or perhaps chose not to. His face was calm, his movements steady and unhurried. He walked slowly to his table, his eyes briefly scanning the room, taking in the sights without any hint of discomfort. If he sensed the quiet disapproval around him, he didn't show it. He simply nodded to the waiter who led him to his seat, thanking him in a soft voice before settling down. As he looked around the room, his eyes held a calmness, a steadiness, almost as if he had been here many times before, even though it was clear to everyone else that he didn't belong. He opened the menu and began reading it with quiet interest, taking his time as though he was savoring each item listed, each dish described. But around him, people continued to notice, their quiet judgments growing. A group of younger diners seated a few tables away laughed softly, glancing in his direction, their voices low but mocking. They whispered to each other, giggling as they exchanged jokes at his expense. One of them leaned over and said something under his breath, and they all laughed louder, not caring if he could hear them. The waiter, a young man with an air of arrogance, approached the old man's table, his expression unreadable, but his posture slightly condescending. When the old man politely placed his order, the waiter barely looked him in the eyes, his voice curt as he repeated the order back to him. There was no warmth, no friendliness, only the faintest hint of annoyance, as if this man's presence was an inconvenience in such an elegant place. The old man waited patiently after placing his order, his eyes wandering across the room as if he were taking in the atmosphere, noting the details. There was a gentleness in his gaze, almost as if he admired the restaurant's beauty and the energy of the lively conversations around him. He seemed unbothered by the glances cast his way, or perhaps he had simply grown used to them over time. Even as whispers continued and subtle smirks crossed faces around him, he remained calm, his posture steady, with a small, almost imperceptible smile. The group of young diners nearby seemed to grow bolder as they watched him. One of them leaned toward the others, suggesting an idea that brought out a ripple of laughter among them. They were speaking just loudly enough for him to hear, clearly not concerned about being overheard. One young man waved over the same waiter who had taken the old man's order, whispering something into his ear with a mischievous grin. The waiter glanced back at the old man, then nodded with a slight smirk, disappearing toward the kitchen as the young diners stifled their laughter. Moments later, the waiter returned, carrying a single glass of tap water. He set it down in front of the old man with a faint smirk, muttering, "Compliments of the house," in a tone that carried a hint of mockery. The young diners watched eagerly, waiting for the old man's reaction, their eyes alight with amusement. It was clear that they saw him as a source of entertainment, a way to pass the time with a cheap laugh. The old man looked at the glass for a long moment. His face remained calm, his expression unchanged, though his fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table. Slowly, he lifted the glass, taking a small sip, his gaze moving briefly to the group of young diners. He met their eyes one by one, with a calm, steady look that carried a quiet strength. His expression was unreadable, neither angry nor hurt, just calm, almost as if he were silently asking them a question they couldn't understand. The young diners fell quiet for a moment, unsettled by his response, unsure of how to react. But they quickly regained their confidence, shrugging off the strange sense of unease his calmness had brought them. They resumed their laughter, muttering amongst themselves, dismissing him with a few more mocking glances. The old man placed the glass back on the table, his movements slow and deliberate. He sat there in silence, his hands resting gently on the edge of the table, his eyes drifting back to his surroundings, as though he were lost in thought. The old man sat quietly, observing his surroundings with an expression of quiet acceptance, his gaze drifting from table to table. He watched couples laughing over candle-lit dinners, families sharing stories, and friends leaning in close, absorbed in lively conversations. Every now and then, he would glance at the younger diners who had been mocking him, his gaze steady and almost knowing, as if he could see beyond their laughter, beyond their youth and confidence. The group of young diners noticed him looking in their direction, and they exchanged amused glances. One of them, a young man with slicked back hair and a loud voice, leaned back in his chair with a smug grin. He made a show of adjusting his expensive watch, a glint of silver catching the restaurant lights, his expression dripping with arrogance as he cast a challenging look back at the old man. "Maybe he's lost," the young man muttered loudly to his friends, making sure the old man could hear. His friends laughed, their voices echoing around the room, drawing the attention of a few nearby tables. The old man's face remained calm, his eyes never wavering. He simply watched, silent and still, his presence a quiet contrast to the noise and energy around him. The young man, emboldened by the old man's silence, leaned forward with a smirk. "I bet he can't even afford a meal here," he sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Probably saved up all month just to sit here and pretend he belongs." His friends laughed again, louder this time, their laughter carrying across the restaurant. As they laughed, a faint murmur began to spread among the other diners. People were starting to notice the group's behavior, glancing curiously between the young diners and the old man. Some looked amused, while others appeared uncomfortable, shifting in their seats as the laughter grew louder and more pointed. A few exchanged sympathetic glances toward the old man, but no one said a word. They all watched, intrigued and perhaps a little uneasy, but unwilling to interfere. The waiter, the same young man who had brought him the glass of water, approached the old man's table again, this time with an expression of barely concealed disdain. He looked down at the old man, his lips twisting in a slight sneer as he held out the menu again. "Are you sure you can afford something here?" he asked, his tone cold and sarcastic. "We have some pretty expensive options." His words were loud enough for several nearby diners to hear, and a few heads turned, their eyes widening in surprise and discomfort. The old man looked up at the waiter, his face calm and composed. He didn't respond to the waiter's tone or the mocking question. Instead, he simply took the menu, his hand steady as he opened it, and studied the options with quiet interest. The waiter, clearly annoyed by the lack of reaction, rolled his eyes and walked away, muttering under his breath as he returned to the group of young diners. They greeted him with grins, and one of them patted him on the back, as if rewarding him for his performance. The old man continued reading the menu, unfazed by the scene that had just played out. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost as if he were savoring each word, each description of the fine dishes listed on the page. His face showed no hint of frustration or anger, only quiet determination, as though he were a man used to enduring worse with grace. After a few minutes, he closed the menu and placed it neatly on the table. His gaze drifted back to the young diners, who were now speaking more loudly, bragging about their lives, their wealth, and their successes. Each of them took turns telling stories that grew more exaggerated with each retelling, their voices filled with self-satisfaction. They laughed and clinked their glasses, reveling in the sound of their own voices, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, that others around them were beginning to feel uncomfortable. At one point, one of the young women in the group glanced over at the old man and raised an eyebrow, her gaze appraising and slightly amused. "Do you think he's ever even heard of a place like this?" she whispered to her friends, her voice carrying a mix of mockery and pity. "I mean, look at him. He's clearly out of his element." The others chuckled, nodding in agreement, their laughter low but filled with a biting edge that echoed around the room. The old man watched them in silence, his face betraying no emotion. He simply sat there, calm and steady, as though he were listening to something only he could hear, something that went beyond their words and their laughter. There was a wisdom in his eyes, a quiet strength that seemed to deepen with each passing second. It was a look that hinted at stories untold, at a life lived with experiences far beyond what anyone in that restaurant could imagine. He reached into his pocket and took out a small, worn leather wallet, its edges frayed and faded with age. He opened it slowly, revealing a few old photographs tucked inside. His fingers brushed lightly over one of the photos, a younger version of himself, smiling with a woman and two small children, all dressed in fine clothes and beaming with happiness. He gazed at the photo for a moment, a flicker of emotion passing across his face before he carefully tucked it back into his wallet and returned it to his pocket. As he did, a strange sense of calm seemed to settle over him, as though he had made some kind of silent decision. His gaze shifted back to the young diners, who were still laughing, still mocking, their voices louder and more confident than ever. They were so absorbed in their own world, so sure of their superiority, that they didn't notice the quiet transformation taking place within the man sitting just a few tables away. Unseen by everyone, he picked up his phone and dialed a number, his voice barely a whisper as he spoke. The conversation was short, his words calm and measured, as though he were making arrangements for something significant, something that would change the course of the evening in ways no one could predict. When he hung up, he placed the phone back on the table, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. Around him, the restaurant continued to buzz with energy, the air thick with laughter and conversation, but the old man's gaze remained steady, focused, as though he were watching something far beyond the room, something only he could see. And as he sat there, silent and composed, a subtle shift began to ripple through the air, an unspoken sense that something was about to happen, something that would leave everyone in that room changed forever. The old man continued to sit, calm and composed, as the evening unfolded around him. The waiter returned, setting down his meal with the same dismissive attitude. The old man thanked him softly, his voice respectful, even as he was met with indifference. Picking up his fork, he began to eat, savoring each bite slowly, as if each taste brought back a memory. His deliberate calmness seemed almost unsettling in a room that thrived on noise, laughter, and social performance. The young diners glanced at him again, their amusement seemingly refreshed by his quiet solitude. They exchanged smug glances, smirking as they watched him enjoy his meal. One of them leaned over and, in a mocking tone, remarked just loud enough to be heard, "He looks like he's never had a decent meal in his life. Wonder how long he saved up just to come here and pretend he belongs." The others chuckled, their laughter rippling through the room, infecting a few nearby tables with quiet smirks and whispers. The old man remained unaffected, his gaze steady as he ate, his movements controlled and unhurried. But there was a subtle change in the air, a quiet strength building behind his calm demeanor, something that only the most observant might have noticed. He finished his meal, placed his utensils neatly on the plate, and took a final sip of water. Then, as if in no rush, he dabbed the corners of his mouth with a napkin, folded it with care, and set it aside. He leaned back slightly, his gaze wandering across the restaurant with a look of almost detached curiosity, as though he were studying the people and the place, taking in every detail. It was then that his phone vibrated on the table and he glanced at the screen. With a small, almost imperceptible nod, he answered, speaking in a low voice, barely audible to anyone else. "Yes," he said simply. "Everything is in order?" "Good." His tone was firm, authoritative, unlike anything anyone in the restaurant had heard from him before. For a brief moment he was transformed, a man who commanded respect and expected nothing less. The group of young diners shifted in their seats, catching the faint change in his tone. One of them, the young man who had been the loudest in mocking him, leaned in closer, his smile fading as he listened, a flicker of curiosity replacing his earlier amusement. The old man ended the call, setting the phone back on the table with a quiet finality. He paused, his gaze lingering on the young man, meeting his eyes with a calm intensity that was impossible to ignore. As the young man squirmed under his gaze, the old man gave a slight, almost polite smile, and finally spoke in a voice that was soft, but carried a weight that silenced the surrounding tables. "You know," he said, his tone steady, "I've been to places like this before. In fact, I used to own a few." His words hung in the air, sinking in slowly, as if each syllable carried a weight that was both unexpected and undeniable. The young diners froze, their expressions shifting from surprise to a dawning realization that perhaps they had misjudged him. They exchanged nervous glances, their previous arrogance fading as they struggled to process his words. Around them, the restaurant grew quieter, patrons leaning in, sensing that something was happening, something that went beyond the usual banter and noise of the evening. The old man leaned forward slightly, his gaze never wavering from the young man's. "There's something very important you learn after years of building and losing, of seeing wealth come and go," he continued, his voice calm and even. "You learn to see people for who they are, not just what they wear or how they look. Respect is something earned, not bought." He paused, letting his words settle, his gaze moving slowly from one young diner to the next, each of them now avoiding his eyes, their faces flushed with shame. The smirks had vanished, replaced by uncomfortable frowns and shifting gazes. For the first time that evening, they were silent, caught off guard and unsure of how to respond. Just as the tension reached its peak, the old man's phone buzzed again. He looked at it briefly, then back at the group, a faint smile playing on his lips as he stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. Without another word, he walked toward the restaurant's front desk, where the manager was standing, observing the scene with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. The old man exchanged a few quiet words with the manager, who nodded, his expression shifting from confusion to shock, then to a kind of reverence. The manager gestured toward the main dining area, his face pale as if he'd just realized the gravity of the situation. The old man nodded, giving him a reassuring pat on the shoulder, before turning back toward the room. All eyes were now on him as he made his way back to his table, calm and unhurried, with the quiet grace of a man who had nothing left to prove. As the old man returned to his table, a ripple of murmurs spread through the restaurant. Patrons who had once dismissed him now leaned in, their curiosity piqued. The young diners sat stiffly, their earlier laughter replaced by an uneasy silence. They watched him carefully, their faces a mixture of confusion and nervousness, as though they were beginning to grasp that the man they had mocked was far more than he seemed. The old man took his seat with the same calmness that had defined him all evening. His demeanor was unchanged, still composed, still unbothered by the judgment and ridicule he had endured. But now, his quiet presence seemed heavier, carrying an undeniable authority. He let the silence stretch, his gaze slowly moving from one young diner to the next, as if giving them a moment to reflect on their behavior. One of the young women who had been part of the group's mockery shifted uncomfortably and glanced around the restaurant, her face flushing with embarrassment. She gave a quick, awkward smile, trying to lighten the moment, but her voice wavered. "We were just having a bit of fun, you know," she said softly, her tone now a shadow of the confidence she had displayed earlier. The old man's gaze settled on her, kind but piercing, and he nodded slowly. "Fun," he repeated, as though testing the word, letting it hang in the air. "Yes. I remember when I was your age. We had fun too, but it was different. He leaned back, folding his hands in front of him, his eyes distant for a moment as if recalling a memory. We were taught to respect people, regardless of how they appeared to us. We were taught that everyone has a story, often much deeper than what you see on the surface. The young woman looked down, unable to meet his gaze, and her friends remained silent, their expressions uncomfortable. A few of the surrounding patrons exchanged guilty looks, reminded of their own quiet judgments when he first entered. The old man continued, his voice calm and even, but now carrying a hint of sadness. It's easy to judge someone based on appearances, especially when you think they don't measure up to your own standards. But life has a way of teaching us, sooner or later, that our judgments are often flawed. His gaze moved to the young man who had been the most vocal, the one who had suggested sending him the glass of tap water as a joke. The young man swallowed, shifting uneasily in his chair. His earlier smugness had vanished, replaced by a look of unease. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. He glanced down at his expensive watch, which only seemed to emphasize his discomfort now. The polished silver a stark reminder of the arrogance he had displayed. The old man let his gaze linger on the young man, his expression unreadable. "You sent me a glass of water," he said softly, the hint of a smile touching his lips. A generous gesture, no doubt. But generosity doesn't come from what you give. It comes from the spirit with which you give it. The young man's face turned red, and he averted his eyes, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. The old man leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper, but it carried through the room with undeniable clarity. "In my experience, kindness and respect go much farther than wealth or status. They're things that can't be taken away, no matter how much you have or lose." Just as he finished speaking, the manager approached their table, visibly anxious, holding a clipboard in his hands. He hesitated for a moment, looking at the old man with an expression of both respect and fear. Clearing his throat, the manager addressed the room, his voice trembling slightly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "I'd like to make an announcement." He glanced at the old man, who nodded, giving him permission to continue. The manager swallowed hard, gathering his composure before he spoke again. "I have just been informed that there has been a change in ownership of this establishment," he said, his voice wavering. A hush fell over the room, and everyone's eyes turned to the old man, their expressions a mixture of shock and disbelief. The young diners looked at each other in stunned silence, realization dawning on their faces. The manager continued, his gaze shifting back to the old man. "This gentleman here is now the owner of the restaurant," he announced, barely able to hide the awe in his voice. The announcement hung in the air like a thunderclap, silencing even the faintest whispers in the room. The once lively restaurant was now steeped in a thick silence, each face a portrait of shock and disbelief. The young diners sat frozen, their previous confidence stripped away, replaced by an uneasy vulnerability. They stared at the old man, their eyes wide, expressions stunned, as they struggled to reconcile the simple, quiet figure they had mocked with the new owner of the prestigious restaurant. The old man sat back in his chair, his expression calm, almost serene, as he let the weight of the revelation sink in. He looked over at the manager, giving him a small nod as if to thank him for the introduction, and then turned his gaze back to the young diners, his eyes holding a mixture of kindness and a touch of disappointment. The young man who had sent the glass of water sat slumped in his chair, the color draining from his face as he avoided the old man's eyes, his earlier arrogance dissolving into shame. Clearing his throat, the old man spoke, his voice soft yet filled with an undeniable authority that commanded the room's full attention. "I came here tonight because I had heard good things about this place. I was told it was a restaurant with high standards, a place that valued quality, both in its food and in its service. I came here hoping to enjoy a nice meal in good company and to experience the hospitality this place was known for." He paused, his gaze drifting over the room, taking in the faces of the patrons and staff, each one seemingly held by the gravity of his words. "But I was greeted with something quite different," judged, mocked, laughed at, not because of my character, but because of my appearance, because I didn't fit the mold of what you thought a successful person should look like. The old man's words fell like stones, each sentence building on the last, creating a quiet but powerful sense of reflection among the listeners. Some diners looked down, their faces tinged with guilt, while the young diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their earlier laughter now a distant, uncomfortable memory. Turning his gaze specifically toward the group of young diners, he continued, "When I was younger, I learned a lesson that stayed with me all my life. Real success doesn't come from showing off or proving yourself to others. It comes from treating people with respect regardless of who they are or what they appear to be. It's something I've tried to live by, and something I hoped to find here tonight." The young man who had started the mocking sat up, his face flushed with embarrassment. He tried to speak, but the words seemed to fail him. His eyes darted nervously around the room, searching for an escape from the uncomfortable spotlight he now found himself in. But the old man's gaze held him firmly, not with anger, but with a quiet disappointment that was somehow even more piercing. The old man leaned forward, his voice dropping just enough to make everyone in the room lean in to hear. "I've decided," he said calmly, "that this restaurant will undergo some changes. I believe respect should be at the heart of any establishment, especially one that serves the public." He let his words settle, watching the faces of those around him as they absorbed the implications of his statement. He turned to the manager, who stood nearby, still visibly shaken by the turn of events. "I'd like you to work with me to ensure that everyone who walks through these doors is treated with kindness and respect, no matter who they are or what they look like," he said, his tone steady but kind. The manager nodded quickly, his expression filled with both relief and admiration. "Yes, sir, absolutely," he said, his voice barely a whisper as he glanced at the young diners, a silent reminder of the behavior that would no longer be tolerated. Looking back at the young diners, the old man gave a small, knowing smile. "You have a lot ahead of you," he said softly, "and you'll face moments when you'll need the help or kindness of someone you might least expect. Remember this night, and remember that everyone you meet deserves your respect. Life has a way of surprising you when you least expect it." One by one, the young diners lowered their heads, humbled and silent, absorbing the weight of his words. The rest of the room watched with a sense of awe and respect, as the old man's quiet wisdom resonated deeply, leaving them with a sense of reflection they would carry beyond the restaurant's walls. With a gentle nod, the old man rose from his seat, taking one last look around the room, his eyes lingering briefly on the young diners, offering them a look of forgiveness and understanding. Then he turned and walked toward the door, leaving behind a restaurant forever changed by his presence. As he exited, a few patrons began to clap softly, a quiet tribute to the dignity and grace of a man who had shown them the true meaning of respect. The applause grew, filling the restaurant with a sense of warmth and unity, as if each clap carried an acknowledgement of the lesson they had all just witnessed. The young diners, now sitting in silent reflection, felt the weight of their actions and the impact of his words, understanding that they had encountered a man who was far richer in spirit than any wealth or status they had once valued. As the old man stepped outside, the cool night air wrapped around him, offering a calm contrast to the intensity of the moments he had just left behind. The faint sounds of clinking glasses and murmured conversations drifted from the restaurant, now softened, respectful, almost reverent in tone. He took a deep breath, a quiet satisfaction settling over him as he looked up at the starlit sky, letting the evening's events wash over him. Inside, the atmosphere had transformed. The young diners sat in silence, their expressions contemplative, each of them turning inward, grappling with the shame and discomfort of their actions. The leader of the group, the one who had mocked the old man the most, looked down at his untouched meal, his face pale, fingers twitching nervously. He glanced at his friends, each of them lost in their own thoughts, avoiding each other's eyes. The room's energy had shifted entirely, the typical noise and laughter replaced by a soft, respectful hum, as if everyone understood they had been part of something significant, something that would linger far beyond this evening. The manager took a deep breath, still standing near the table where the old man had sat, his mind racing. He realized now the magnitude of what had happened, and felt an urgency to honor the message that the old man had left them. This was more than just a change in ownership. It was a call to transform the very essence of the restaurant. Steeling himself, he approached the table where the young diners sat, his expression firm yet understanding. "I hope you all understand," he began quietly, his voice steady but serious, "that tonight was a reminder, for all of us, of the value of respect, no matter who we are or who we think others are." His eyes swept across their faces, ensuring his message resonated. "The new owner has shown us a level of grace that we did not deserve. It's on us to carry forward what he's left behind, to make this place worthy of his vision." The young man who had led the taunting looked up, his face tinged with shame. His voice was small, uncertain, as he finally found the courage to speak. We didn't know," he stammered, glancing down, unable to meet the manager's gaze. "I thought he was just—" He trailed off, the words he had once spoken with ease now feeling hollow, tasteless. The manager looked at him with a mixture of disappointment and empathy. "That's the thing," he replied softly. "We often don't know the stories of others, but that doesn't give us the right to judge or belittle them." His words hung in the air, and the young diners absorbed them, nodding slowly, the weight of their mistake pressing down on them. As the young diners sat in silence, reflecting on the night, a server approached them, a young woman who had witnessed the entire scene. Her voice was gentle but carried a hint of reproach as she spoke. "You know, he came here tonight with no expectations, just hoping to enjoy a quiet meal," she said. "But you all took that away from him because you couldn't see past his appearance. Maybe it's time to think about why you felt that way, and what it says about the kind of people you want to be." The young diners looked at her, their faces flushed with embarrassment. Each one felt a growing realization that they had not only mocked a man of status, but had disrespected someone who was genuinely wise and kind. Their arrogance had blinded them, and they had allowed their privilege to cloud their humanity. The leader of the group reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, his hands trembling slightly as he took out a few bills and set them on the table. "I don't know if this can make up for anything," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "but I want to cover his meal. It's the least I can do." The manager gave a small nod, accepting the gesture but knowing that this act alone couldn't erase the memory of what had happened. "It's a start," he said softly. "But remember, real change isn't about paying a bill. It's about how you treat people from this point forward." As the young diners sat there, contemplating the truth of his words, they began to understand that this night would stay with them. They had encountered something rare, an opportunity to see their own shortcomings and grow beyond them. It was humbling, and though painful, they felt a strange sense of gratitude for the lesson. Outside, the old man walked down the quiet street, a slight smile tugging at his lips as he reflected on the events. He felt a peace that came not from proving anything to others, but from knowing he had left behind something more valuable than any material wealth. The message of respect, the subtle reminder that everyone, regardless of appearance, deserves kindness, would now live on within those walls. As he continued down the street, fading into the night, a sense of renewal lingered in the restaurant. The patrons, staff, and especially the young diners would remember this evening, a night when a quiet, unassuming man had reminded them all of the true meaning of respect, leaving a legacy that would outlast any meal or momentary laughter. As the old man disappeared into the night, the young diners lingered at their table, haunted by the evening's events. The restaurant felt different now, subdued, almost reverent. Other patrons were finishing their meals in silence, each seemingly lost in thought, still processing the quiet power of the old man's words and actions. Some nodded quietly to themselves, a new sense of humility settling over the room. One by one, the young diners began to speak, their voices soft, each admitting a sliver of shame and regret. The young man who had led the mockery looked down at his hands, his fingers tracing the edge of his plate as he struggled to find the right words. "You know," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "I've spent so much time thinking I was better than people who didn't have what I had." He shook his head, a bitter smile crossing his face. "But he showed us all something different tonight." The others nodded, each of them grappling with the weight of their actions. One of the young women, who had initially laughed at the old man's appearance, spoke up, her eyes filled with guilt. "We judged him for looking out of place," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "But maybe we're the ones who don't belong in a place like this, if we're going to treat people that way." They fell into silence again, each absorbed in their own reflection, the reality of the old man's message settling deeper within them. Their earlier confidence, their pride in their own wealth and appearance, now felt shallow, meaningless. In a single evening, their perspective had shifted, and they began to see themselves through a new lens, one that showed them how far they still had to grow. The manager approached their table once more, observing their downcast faces. There was no judgment in his eyes now, only a quiet understanding. He cleared his throat gently, capturing their attention. "It's not too late to change," he said, his voice calm but encouraging. "What happened tonight can be a moment you learn from, or it can just be another story. The choice is yours." The leader of the group, the young man who had been so quick to judge, looked up, his face filled with regret but also a newfound determination. "I don't want it to be just another story," he replied softly. "I want it to mean something." The manager gave a small nod, his expression approving. "Then start by treating others with the respect he showed you tonight, not just here but wherever you go." The young man nodded, his resolve growing stronger. "I will," he promised, his voice steady. The others looked at him, then at each other, each silently committing to carry forward the lesson they had learned. This wasn't just about making amends for one evening. It was about changing how they saw the world, how they saw themselves, and how they treated others moving forward. As they left the restaurant, they each felt a sense of humility and quiet gratitude. They had come in expecting an ordinary night of laughter and indulgence, but were leaving with something much more valuable. A reminder that true worth isn't measured by wealth or status, but by kindness, humility, and respect. Outside, the city lights cast a gentle glow over them, illuminating their path as they walked away, each of them lost in thought. They didn't speak much, but a silent understanding flowed between them, a newfound bond shaped by the evening's events. And though the old man was gone, his lesson remained, a lasting imprint on their hearts and minds. They knew they would carry his words with them, a quiet reminder that would shape their actions and their character, long after the lights of the restaurant faded behind them. That night, as they returned to their separate lives, they felt changed, aware that they had experienced a rare moment of truth, a chance to grow, to become better than they had been. It was a gift they hadn't expected, and one they would never forget. Later that night, each of the young diners lay awake, replaying the evening's events in their minds. The old man's words echoed in their thoughts, stirring something deeper than they had expected. Alone with their reflections, they began to confront aspects of themselves they had long ignored or justified. The arrogance, the quick judgments, the ease with which they'd belittled a stranger. All of it now felt raw and uncomfortable. The young man who had led the group, once so quick to mock, found himself deeply unsettled. His mind drifted back to the old man's steady gaze, the quiet strength he had displayed in the face of their ridicule. The memory was humbling, and it brought a sting of shame that refused to fade. He thought about his own life, how he had prided himself on success and wealth, wearing them like armor to shield himself from any vulnerability. But tonight, in the presence of someone who had shown him true dignity, those things felt hollow, insufficient. He got up, moved to his desk, and opened his laptop. He typed slowly, thoughtfully, drafting a message. It was an apology addressed to the restaurant's management, asking them to pass it on to the new owner if possible. In it, he wrote about his regret, his acknowledgement of the arrogance he had displayed, and his gratitude for the lesson he had learned. He poured out his reflections, hoping that somehow his words might reach the old man. Finishing the message, he closed the laptop and sat back, feeling a small sense of relief. The others in their own homes found similar restlessness. The young woman who had mocked the old man's appearance thought about her own life, how much value she placed on status and appearance, and how easily she had used those things to judge others. She thought about the look in the old man's eyes, that blend of understanding and disappointment, and realized that she wanted to be seen differently, to live differently. In the following days, subtle changes began to shape their lives. The young man found himself listening more intently in conversations, withholding judgment, approaching each person he met with a new sense of curiosity and respect. He noticed details he had overlooked before, the way a barista smiled when greeted with kindness, the pride with which a taxi driver spoke of his children. Little by little, he found that treating others with respect gave him a deeper, more lasting sense of fulfillment than any display of wealth or status ever had. The young woman, too, began to shift her outlook. She made an effort to treat people kindly, to engage without assumptions, and to approach each interaction with an open heart. She found that people responded to her differently, with warmth and sincerity, and this change began to shape her life in ways she hadn't anticipated. Months passed, and each of the young diners carried the old man's lesson with them, allowing it to transform the way they lived. They didn't speak often, each busy with their own lives, but they held a shared understanding, an invisible thread connecting them through the memory of that night. One day, the young man who had led the mockery returned to the restaurant, now under new management and thriving with a reputation for exceptional service. He requested a table, but this time he was alone, and his demeanor was humble, reflective. The manager, who remembered him from that unforgettable evening, approached with a smile, sensing the difference in his presence. The young man looked around the room, noticing how everyone, regardless of appearance, was treated with warmth and respect. He felt a quiet pride in knowing that he had, in some small way, contributed to this change. He ordered a simple meal, enjoying each bite as he reflected on the journey that had brought him here. As he finished, he looked toward the front of the restaurant, almost expecting to see the old man's calm figure walking in. But he knew the old man's legacy was already here, woven into the very fabric of the place, guiding every interaction and setting a standard that would last long after he was gone. The young man left the restaurant that day with a peaceful heart, carrying forward the lesson that had changed him. The memory of the old man, his strength, his dignity, his quiet wisdom, would stay with him, reminding him always that true respect, once learned, becomes a gift that never stops giving. As life continued, the memory of the old man and that transformative evening remained a guiding force in each of their lives. The young diners had been given an unspoken bond through their shared experience, a reminder of humility and respect that continued to shape them, not just in small gestures, but in profound ways. Months turned into years, and each of them found their paths influenced by that single night. The young man who had been the loudest in mocking the old man took his first steps toward a meaningful shift. His career, once focused solely on personal gain, began to expand with a new purpose. He started seeking ways to use his resources for others, investing in community projects and creating opportunities for people who lacked the advantages he had taken for granted. It was no longer about recognition or status for him. It was about making a difference in ways that mattered. He saw it as a quiet homage to the man who had taught him the power of dignity. The young woman who had laughed at the old man's appearance went on to build her own business, one she based not on appearances but on values. Her company was rooted in treating people with kindness and fairness, regardless of their backgrounds. She made it a point to know her employees personally, to hear their stories, and to honor their individuality. Her success grew from this philosophy, and she often found herself thinking back to that night, thankful for the lesson that had realigned her priorities. One day, years later, they gathered again, this time by chance. Each had followed different paths, Yet when they saw each other, there was a mutual understanding, a shared knowledge that no words could capture. Over coffee, they reminisced about that night in the restaurant, speaking of the old man's impact on their lives. They shared stories of how that moment had changed them, how they had carried his lesson into the world in their own unique ways. In the middle of their conversation, a young waiter approached their table, carrying their drinks with a genuine, warm smile. As he set down their cups, he paused, looking at them thoughtfully. "You know," he said, "it's strange, but you all seem familiar, like I've met you before." The group exchanged glances, smiling knowingly. They hadn't met him, but in some way they felt connected to him, and to everyone who had walked through the doors of that restaurant since that night. The old man's influence had become a legacy, a quiet ripple that had extended far beyond the walls of that single place, touching lives in ways they could have never imagined. As the young waiter walked away, they raised their cups in a silent toast to the memory of the man who had changed their lives with nothing more than his dignity and wisdom. They knew that, wherever he was, his legacy continued to grow, living on in every respectful word, every kind gesture, every moment of humility they shared with others. The lesson was timeless, passed down quietly, with no fanfare, yet as enduring and powerful as the night they first learned it. Years passed, and the old man's legacy quietly endured, subtly influencing those he had impacted that night. His story became a reminder, a shared memory that found its way into countless conversations, shaping new lives in unexpected ways. Although the young diners had gone on to build successful careers, families, and friendships, they each held his lesson close, weaving it into the fabric of their lives. One evening, the young man who had led the taunting found himself telling the story to his own children. They were gathered around him, wide-eyed and curious as he recounted the details. He didn't embellish or hold back, describing the arrogance he'd felt, the judgment he'd cast, and the shame that followed. The memory was vivid, and he could feel the weight of it even as he spoke, but he shared it openly, hoping his children would learn from his mistakes. When he reached the part about the old man's revelation, how he had quietly and gracefully transformed the room with his words, he paused, looking at his children, who were listening with rapt attention. "That night," he said, his voice softening, "I learned that real wealth isn't what you can buy or wear. It's in how you treat people, how you carry yourself. It's in kindness, in humility, in respect." His daughter, the younger of the two, asked softly, "Did you ever see him again?" The young man shook his head, a thoughtful smile playing on his lips. "No, I didn't, but he changed me. And that change, that's how I see him every day, in every person I meet. It's how I remember him." Elsewhere, the other members of the group shared their own versions of the story in moments that mattered. The young woman, now a leader in her company, would recount it to her team during new hire orientations, sharing it as a guiding principle for how she wanted her business to be known. "We're here to succeed, yes," she would say, "but never at the expense of treating others with respect. No matter who they are, everyone deserves kindness." The story took on a life of its own, passed on to others, employees, family members, friends, spreading quietly but steadily, just as the old man had intended. It was no longer just a memory of one night in a restaurant. It had become a symbol of the values that truly mattered, values that transcended wealth or status. In another part of the city, the restaurant where it all began had grown in reputation. Patrons knew it not only for its fine cuisine, but for the warmth and inclusiveness that defined its atmosphere. The staff held themselves to the standards set by the restaurant's new owner years ago. New employees were trained not just in service, but in the philosophy of respect and dignity for every person who walked through the doors, a principle that had become their quiet code. The restaurant had even come to be known for a small but significant tradition. At every table, a single glass of water was served first, a subtle nod to the night the old man had taught them all a lesson. It was a reminder that appearances were never the whole story, and that humility was worth more than any wealth. Patrons often asked about the significance, and the staff would smile, telling a simplified version of the story, sharing just enough to keep the memory alive. And so, as years turned into decades, the old man's legacy became more than just an event remembered by a few people. It grew into a quiet influence, a philosophy that touched hundreds, then thousands, a testament to the power of one simple, profound act of grace. In the end, he became part of the city's lore, a figure spoken of with reverence, whose quiet wisdom continued to ripple outward, unseen yet profoundly felt, reminding each person who heard his story of the true meaning of respect and the lasting impact of kindness. As the years rolled on, the old man's legacy seemed to blossom in ways that no one could have predicted. The restaurant became a landmark, not only for its high-quality cuisine, but for the reputation it held as a place where people were treated with dignity and kindness. Travelers from neighboring towns and even different cities would hear whispers of the restaurant's unique ambiance, and they came, curious to experience it for themselves. Each time a new guest arrived, they would be served a glass of water upon seating. This small, quiet gesture puzzled newcomers at first, but for regulars, it had become an unspoken symbol of the establishment's core values. Patrons who knew the story would smile knowingly, and those unfamiliar would often ask the staff about the custom. The waitstaff, carefully trained in the restaurant's values, would tell the story in a way that kept it alive, sharing just enough to convey the impact, but holding back details, as if preserving a sacred memory. The reputation of the restaurant's unique tradition began to circulate in local publications. Journalists, bloggers, and influencers would visit, intrigued by the mystery of the place and the tale behind it. One evening, a young journalist arrived, having heard about the story through whispers from others. She was determined to capture its essence, to understand what made this place so different. As she dined, she noticed how the staff moved with warmth and purpose, treating each guest, from the wealthiest patron to the humblest visitor, with equal respect and care. She observed how people at different tables seemed to converse more openly, as if the air itself encouraged kindness and empathy. The glass of water sat before her, clear and simple, yet bearing a weight she could feel. When she asked a server about it, he shared the tale, his tone reverent, as if telling a legend passed down through generations. The journalist was captivated, and she wrote an article about the restaurant, focusing not on the menu or the decor, but on the story of the old man who had reshaped its identity. Her words spread quickly, reaching readers far and wide. People were drawn to the story, its simplicity, its depth, its reminder of values that resonated with everyone. Soon, the story of the restaurant and its founder became widely known, inspiring discussions in workplaces, classrooms, and families about humility, respect, and the power of one person's example to create lasting change. Somewhere in the city, the young diners who had once mocked the old man had grown older, now middle-aged, each of them living lives shaped by that evening's lesson. They would occasionally meet, often in moments of nostalgia, recalling the night that had altered the course of their lives. Each of them had built something meaningful in their own way, grounded by the values the old man had instilled in them. The young man, now a successful business owner, had kept his promise to live by the old man's example. His company, known for its integrity and social responsibility, often made charitable contributions anonymously, reflecting his belief that kindness didn't need recognition. When people asked him why he ran his business the way he did, he would sometimes tell a brief version of the story, leaving out names and details but preserving the essence of that night. The young woman who had built her own company found that her business thrived because of her commitment to treating every employee with dignity. She had implemented policies that encouraged respect and inclusion, fostering an environment where everyone felt valued. Whenever she encountered a challenging moment in her leadership, she would recall the old man's quiet grace, reminding herself that true strength came from humility and understanding. Their paths had intertwined deeply with the old man's lesson, and each felt a sense of gratitude for the quiet way he had reshaped their lives. They had never seen him again, but in moments of reflection, they felt his influence as strongly as ever, like an invisible hand guiding them. One day, a former member of the group returned to the restaurant, now with his own children in tow. He sat them down, telling them about the significance of the glass of water. As his children listened, he shared the story not as a confession, but as a life lesson, a reminder that who they chose to be mattered more than anything they might achieve. The years turned into decades, and the restaurant continued to thrive, the old man's legacy woven into its foundation. Eventually, the establishment was passed on to new owners, who embraced the values they had inherited, keeping the tradition of the water glass alive. They understood that they were not just running a business, they were caretakers of a legacy that had touched countless lives. In time, the story of the old man became part of local folklore, shared and reshaped in each retelling, but always carrying the same core lesson. That one act of humility, one display of quiet strength could ripple outward, changing hearts and lives long after the moment itself had passed. As the restaurant continued to serve its patrons, each glass of water placed on each table bore a silent message to everyone who dined there. A message that the smallest gestures, the simplest kindnesses, could carry the weight of something timeless. And so, in quiet, everyday moments, the old man's lesson lived on, carried forward by those who had felt its impact, becoming a legacy of respect that would never fade. Many years later, the restaurant had evolved into something of a legend, a place whose legacy stretched far beyond fine dining. It had become a symbol of integrity and respect, known not just for its food but for the values that permeated its very atmosphere. People traveled from distant cities, drawn not just by the stories they'd heard, but by a desire to experience this place of respect, as it had come to be known. The restaurant's walls held framed articles and letters sent by patrons from around the world, each expressing gratitude for an experience that had moved them, each recalling a small act of kindness or an unexpected lesson in humility they'd encountered during their visit. People would leave handwritten notes tucked under their plates, sharing stories of how they had been treated with unexpected warmth and dignity. Over time, the collection grew, forming a wall of memories that reminded everyone, staff and patrons alike, of the deeper purpose the restaurant served. The restaurant's most recent owner, a young woman named Anna, had taken great care to preserve its unique traditions. She felt honored to be the latest custodian of its legacy, a responsibility she held close to her heart. On the anniversary of the restaurant's founding, Anna held a small ceremony, inviting longtime patrons, former employees, and local community members to share in a night of reflection. They came from all walks of life, each one connected by the values the restaurant had instilled over the years. The night was filled with heartfelt stories and quiet gratitude. As guests exchanged tales of the ways the restaurant had impacted them, Anna decided to share a story of her own. She stood before the gathered crowd, her voice calm, but carrying the weight of generations of respect. Years ago, she began, a man entered this restaurant and through one simple act, reshaped everything it stood for. I never met him, but his presence has been with me every day since I took ownership. His legacy is in each glass of water we serve, in the way we greet every person who walks through these doors. His story is a reminder that small moments, when filled with kindness, can carry on long after we're gone. As Anna spoke, a soft murmur of agreement flowed through the room, each person reflecting on their own memories of the restaurant's spirit. A young man near the back of the room raised his hand, asking to speak. His face held a look of awe and quiet reverence. "I want to thank this place," he began, his voice filled with emotion. "I came here years ago, a different person than I am now. At a time when I thought status and appearance were everything, this restaurant showed me something greater. I don't think I'd be the person I am today if it weren't for that experience." Anna listened, her heart full as more voices chimed in, each person sharing a different version of the same story, a night or moment in this restaurant that had left them changed. She realized that this place had become more than just a business. It was a haven for reflection, a place where people were reminded of their better selves. As the evening wound down, Anna held up her glass of water, a subtle nod to the tradition that had been carried on for so many years. The room grew silent, and the guests, sensing the significance of the gesture, followed suit, each lifting their own glass of water. "To the man who started it all," Anna said softly, her voice steady with respect. "May his legacy of kindness continue to touch lives, one glass of water at a time." The room echoed with murmured toasts, each person raising their glass, honoring not only the memory of the man but the lasting impact of his lesson. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the shared understanding that kindness could outlast lifetimes, Anna knew that the spirit of the old man would live on, woven into every corner of the restaurant, filling each day with a little more grace, humility, and respect. As the guests sipped from their glasses, they felt connected not only to the man but to each other, bound by a collective promise to carry his lesson forward. And so, with each gentle sip, the legacy continued, a silent yet powerful tribute to a man who had transformed a simple place into a timeless reminder of the enduring power of respect. As the years continued to pass, the story of the old man and his lesson reached farther than anyone could have anticipated. His legacy had been quietly carried by every visitor who experienced the restaurant's unique spirit, by each server who had passed down the tale, and by every manager who made sure the tradition of the water glass remained. The restaurant itself had grown into a place of almost mythical reputation, a destination not only for its food, but for the intangible sense of honor and kindness that filled its walls. One day, an elderly gentleman entered the restaurant, moving with a slow but purposeful gait. He was dressed in simple, well-worn clothing, and his eyes held a wisdom that drew the attention of everyone around him. The hostess, sensing something special about him, greeted him warmly and led him to a seat near the window, a quiet corner where he could enjoy his meal undisturbed. As he settled in, the waiter brought over a glass of water, placing it on the table before him with a respectful nod. The old man looked at the glass thoughtfully, his fingers tracing the edge as if he were recalling a memory hidden in its depths. After a long moment, he smiled, lifting the glass in a quiet, personal toast before taking a sip. Meanwhile, across the restaurant, Anna, the current owner, noticed the elderly man. She was used to the diverse array of patrons who came to dine, but something about him seemed different, as though he belonged here in a way that few others did. Intrigued, she made her way over to his table, a gentle smile on her face. "Good afternoon, sir," she said warmly. "I hope you're enjoying your visit. Is there anything I can get for you?" The man looked up at her, his gaze steady and filled with a kindness that seemed to carry decades of wisdom. He shook his head softly. "Thank you, dear," he replied in a calm, warm voice. "Just being here is enough." They exchanged a few pleasantries, and Anna found herself drawn into a quiet conversation with him. They spoke about the restaurant, its unique reputation, and the many lives it had touched over the years. The old man listened intently, nodding as she recounted stories of people who had found inspiration within these walls, how strangers had come together over shared values, and how his story, though only known in whispers, had reached so many. At one point, the man's eyes sparkled with a hint of recognition. He looked around the room as if seeing the legacy he had left behind. "You know," he said softly, his voice barely more than a whisper, "sometimes the smallest gestures carry the greatest weight. You may not always see their impact, but they live on in the hearts of those they touch." Anna felt a chill run down her spine as she listened to his words, sensing the depth of his understanding. She studied him for a moment, piecing together fragments of the stories she had heard, wondering if she was sitting across from the man who had started it all. The realization was almost too much to believe, and yet, looking into his wise, compassionate eyes, she knew it had to be true. "Are you—" she began, her voice catching, unable to finish the question. The old man simply smiled, his expression soft and knowing, as though he understood her thoughts. He didn't confirm it, nor did he deny it, choosing instead to leave the moment open, an unspoken truth that they both felt deeply. As they sat in silence, Anna found herself overwhelmed with gratitude. She realized she was in the presence of the very soul who had transformed this place with a single act of humility. She felt honored, almost as if she were touching history, bearing witness to the quiet power of kindness. After a few minutes, the old man rose to leave, offering her a gentle nod. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for keeping the spirit alive." She watched as he walked slowly toward the door, his presence seeming to fill the room even as he prepared to depart. Before he left, he paused by the entrance, glancing back one last time with a contented look, and then, as quietly as he had come, he was gone, leaving behind a sense of peace that lingered in the air, filling the restaurant with an even greater sense of purpose. Anna stood there, rooted to the spot, a single tear tracing down her cheek. She felt as though she had just witnessed something profoundly sacred. From that day forward, she carried that encounter within her, a treasured memory that served as a personal reminder of the legacy she was now part of. She knew that the old man's presence would live on, not just in the traditions and the stories, but in the very essence of the place. His quiet strength, his wisdom, and his kindness had become woven into the soul of the restaurant, an eternal tribute to the power of respect and humility. And every time Anna looked at a simple glass of water on a table, she would remember the man who had taught her, and countless others, that sometimes the most powerful legacies are those built on the smallest of acts, shared in silence, and carried forward in the hearts of those who understand their true worth. In the weeks that followed the old man's visit, Anna felt a renewed sense of purpose guiding her every decision. She felt as if he had entrusted her with something sacred, a legacy she was not just preserving, but now actively shaping. She noticed how even the smallest gestures took on a deeper meaning, a quiet but constant reminder of the old man's lesson echoing in her mind. The smallest gestures carry the greatest weight. The staff, noticing her sense of quiet reverence, began to treat the restaurant's traditions with even more respect, sensing the depth of the values they were upholding. The story of the old man's impact continued to spread beyond the restaurant walls, reaching farther than ever before. One day, a letter arrived, addressed simply to "The Restaurant with the Glass of Water." The sender was a teacher from a nearby town who had heard the story from a former student. In her letter, she explained how she'd incorporated the tale of the restaurant into her curriculum, teaching her students about humility, respect, and kindness. "I wanted my students to understand," the letter read, "that true strength lies in how we treat others, especially those we might underestimate. Your story has inspired not only them, but myself as well. Thank you for carrying this message forward." Attached to the letter were handwritten notes from the students, each one sharing a unique takeaway from the story. Some wrote about how it inspired them to be kinder to others, while others reflected on their own experiences with judgment and how they wanted to change. Anna read each note carefully, moved by the thought that the restaurant's message was now reaching young hearts, shaping the values of future generations. She framed the letter and placed it on the wall with the others, knowing that the story was now as much a part of her as it was of the restaurant. Inspired by the teacher's letter, Anna began to consider new ways to expand the restaurant's legacy. She organized monthly gatherings, inviting people from the community to share their own stories of kindness and respect. These gatherings became a tradition, a space where people of all backgrounds could connect, inspired by the values that the restaurant had come to represent. Each gathering started with a quiet moment, a simple glass of water on each table, as a nod to the legacy of the man who had unknowingly created something so powerful. Word of the gathering spread, drawing guests from all walks of life, business people, artists, teachers, families, all coming together, united by the shared desire to be part of something meaningful. The gatherings became a cornerstone of the restaurant's identity, a living testament to the lasting impact of one person's quiet strength and humility. Years later, when Anna retired, she passed the restaurant to a young couple who had attended many of those gatherings, two people deeply moved by the values it upheld. They took on the responsibility with the same reverence and dedication, honoring the traditions and ensuring that every new employee understood the true essence of the place. Anna visited often, each time feeling the same sense of gratitude she had felt the night she met the old man, now etched into the very soul of the restaurant. The restaurant continued to thrive, its story becoming a part of local history, passed down through generations. It was no longer just a place to eat. It was a place to experience the enduring power of kindness. Parents brought their children, telling them the story of the old man as they looked at the glass of water, inspiring them with values that would guide them throughout their lives. And so, long after the old man had left, his lesson lived on, growing quietly, like roots spreading deep into the earth. The restaurant became a beacon, a reminder that even the simplest actions, born from humility and respect, could create ripples that would never fade. The legacy of the old man, the glass of water, and the quiet strength of his actions remained, shaping hearts and lives, inspiring kindness that would last for generations to come. Many decades passed, and the restaurant remained a cherished part of the community, its walls now adorned with countless letters, photographs, and mementos from patrons who had experienced its message firsthand. The restaurant had seen generations come and go, each one touched by the story of the old man, each one adding its own memories and experiences to the evolving legacy. The simple act of placing a glass of water at each table had become a universally recognized symbol, a silent reminder of humility, respect, and the power of small acts of kindness. One evening, an elderly woman entered the restaurant, moving slowly, a look of nostalgia in her eyes. She was alone, yet she carried a quiet confidence, a sense of belonging, as if she were returning to a place she had known long ago. The hostess greeted her warmly, recognizing the look that many patrons wore when they had heard the restaurant's story or felt its legacy in their lives. She led the woman to a table by the window, a seat with a view of the softly lit streets outside. The elderly woman gazed around the room, her eyes drifting over the walls filled with notes and photographs, each one a testament to the lives the restaurant had touched. She noticed the framed letter from the teacher, the collection of children's notes, and the stories shared by visitors from across the world. A gentle smile crossed her face as she reached out, touching one of the frames as if connecting with the memories it held. As she sat down, a young server approached her with the customary glass of water, setting it on the table with a respectful nod. She looked up at him, her smile warm and understanding. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying a depth of gratitude. She lifted the glass, as so many before her had done, in a silent toast to the legacy that had endured across generations. The server, sensing her familiarity with the tradition, lingered for a moment, curious. "Have you been here before?" he asked gently. The woman nodded, her eyes twinkling with fondness. "Oh, yes," she replied, her voice filled with emotion. "Many, many years ago. This place, it has always meant something special to me." She paused, as if gathering her thoughts before continuing. "I was here on the night it all began," she said, her words soft but certain. "I was one of the young diners that night, a part of the group who mocked a man we did not understand." Her gaze grew distant as memories flooded back. "I was foolish then, full of pride and quick to judge. But he showed me something greater, something that has stayed with me my entire life." The server listened intently, captivated. He had heard fragments of the story from his training, but never from someone who had been there that night. It was as if a piece of history had come to life before him. "He taught us a lesson that night," she continued, "one that I have carried through all these years. I built my life around it, tried to instill it in my children, my grandchildren." Her voice trembled slightly as she looked around, seeing the impact of that moment reflected in every corner of the room. It's humbling to see how far his kindness has reached, how many lives he touched, simply by being himself, by refusing to let our foolishness taint his dignity. She took a sip from the glass of water, her eyes misty with gratitude and reverence. The server, deeply moved, stood quietly, allowing her the space to remember. After a moment, she looked up at him, her face soft with a gentle smile. "Thank you for keeping this tradition alive," she said. "It may seem small, but it's everything. I hope you understand that." The young server nodded, now grasping the depth of his role in a way he hadn't before. "Thank you," he replied sincerely, feeling the weight of her words settle into his heart. "It's an honor to be part of something like this." The elderly woman spent the rest of the evening in peaceful reflection, savoring her meal, and the memories that flooded back to her with each taste, each sound, each glance at the familiar glass of water. When she finally stood to leave, she took a last, lingering look around the room, her heart full of quiet gratitude. As she stepped out into the cool night, she felt the familiar weight of the lesson she had learned so many years ago, its impact still shaping her actions, her thoughts, her very being. She knew that the old man's legacy would live on, not just in the restaurant, but in every life it had touched, every heart it had opened, and every act of kindness it had inspired. And so, as she walked down the street and disappeared into the night, the light from the restaurant cast a warm glow, a beacon of the values it represented. The simple glass of water would remain on each table, a quiet testament to a man who had once sat alone, facing unkindness and responded with grace. His story, woven into the lives of so many, would continue to ripple outward, a legacy that time could never diminish. As the years passed, the legacy of the old man grew, reaching countless lives, quietly reminding each one of the true power of humility and respect. His simple act transformed a single restaurant into a beacon of kindness, proving that even the smallest gestures can leave a lasting impact. Let this story be a reminder. True strength lies in how we treat others. Share this with someone who could use a reminder of the power of respect.